Hello everyone, and welcome to Valois Dark Arts, for those seeking deeper meaning in the dark. I am Nero de Valois of De Valois Spiritual Services, and I will be your host and your guide this evening. Welcome to episode 1 of De Valois Dark Arts. So, if you're listening to this, and you don't know who I am, well, don't worry, you will learn very shortly. As I said, my name is Nero de Valois, and this audio show, De Valois Dark Arts, is an extension of my business, De Valois Spiritual Services, based out of Austin, Texas. It is a metaphysical and spiritual business with sort of side segues into art and many other things. If you aren't already familiar, I participate locally in the Austin Witches Circle, and basically I'm trying to wiggle my way into the local scene there a bit more solidly. Certainly do have friends and connections and whatnot, but it can be a little interesting being a young practitioner. So again, that's a little bit more about who I am, about why I'm doing this, but enough about the business. A lot of you who may be listening to this are very well aware of my metaphysical services and those things that I offer, and that's not really what we're here for. This is not De Valois Spiritual Services, this is De Valois Dark Arts. This is my sort of instructional podcast, so to speak. Obviously, as you can see, unlike my Facebook Live videos on my business page, you do not see my face. I am much less fidgety. Hopefully, we can get things going a little more steady here. So, for the important bits. Now, a lot of people who even follow my business don't really know this, which is part of the reason I'm doing it. Who am I? Well, I've given you my name several times over. I'm rather proud of it, not gonna lie. I am a young folk witch. I'm in my mid-20s. I'm also a spirit worker, artist, intuitive. Basically been involved in things pretty consistently since I was in my teens. Something I've always been drawn to. I was a very strange, morbid young child. Always very hypersensitive to things, emotions, people, spirits, things of that nature. And it very much impacted me as a young child in such a way that I was always very drawn to occult practice and eventually pagan practice, to the point where by the time I was in my early teens, sort of dipping sort of the first signs into Wicca, and even previously to that, due to some research, I will admit, because of my reading of the Harry Potter series, sort of sticking my toe into Western ceremonial magic, mostly the old grimoires and learning about the Keys of Solomon and that kind of thing, because I was doing a lot of reading on, where did J.K. Rowling come up with these things, and I'm very much a product of my generation that way. So people may deprive it and make fun of it and whatnot, but that's basically a big part of who I am. How do I practice? That's also a very, very good question. I've mostly been solitary for most of my practice. This isn't to say I don't involve myself in groups. I have involved myself with group practice fairly consistently, as often as I can. Most, starting in my late teens, and sort of consistently on and off up until this point. It is not a group that I'm currently working with, but I have certainly, I've been exposed to many Wiccan covens. I've been exposed here in Austin. There's a Druidic grove that I was very active with for a time. At least I was officially like a friend of that grove. Never really saw active membership in sort of any sort of initiatory order, whether that be a grove or a coven. I did spend some time. Have been very naturally, especially being interested in Western ceremonial magic, beginning at the start of my practice. was very drawn to Thelema. So when I came to Austin, I actually spent a lot of time around sort of the OTO, and also again determined that, you know, that kind of initiatory order, I'm very much a folk witch and have the eclecticism that comes from that. So it was never something that appealed to me. Now, a lot of people are going to go, oh, you're just an eclectic, you're not a folk witch. Those two aren't you know, synonymous. A lot of times they aren't. For me, they're one very much flows out of the other. I've always sort of taken a folk witch approach to things. That was what I ended up taking away from Wicca. That was having studied Western ceremonial magic, sort of figuring out that, okay, all of the sort of pomp and circumstance, that was not really my style. Finding out, even within the past couple of years, that I very much like hands-on sort of artistic ways of performing the craft, sort of drew me back towards sort of a folkish practice, which honestly goes back. I have sort of a family heritage in the lowlands of Appalachia and the Ozarks, and that very much sort of goes back to that sort of cultural upbringing. Finding out that I was sort of exposed to magic in a way, even at a young age there, that I wasn't really familiar with. I definitely do not make the claim of hereditary witch, but you get cultural influences. It's not like growing up in Louisiana, but it was similar enough. Why did I start practicing? I alluded to this a little bit earlier, that I've always been really, really sensitive. One of the things on my business page that I offer is aura readings, and that's actually something I've been able to do since I was a young child. Obviously it took several years to hone it. I'm still sort of working at the kinks sometimes. It's having that kind of sensitivity. It takes a lot of discipline to be able to deal with it. So that was a big motivator for things. And then again, I mentioned sort of being this sort of odd little morbid kid. That had to do a lot with it. So that sort of in short summary is me. I've had training through several sources. My first primary teacher was legitimately a Christian folk witch, so a lot of my foundations came from that, and a lot of the reason why I stuck with that kind of practice is because of her instruction. Wonderful lady by the name of Aslan. I've actually lost touch with her. She got really sick with cancer after a while, and then she and I just ended up going different ways, and that was just life. But my actual initiatory experience was through her, even though that we were, you know, it was still sort of distance learning, but that was my initiatory experience. Like, I did have an initiation from an older witch in my teens, which was a hugely profound experience for me. Unfortunately, a lot of the spells I inherited from her I do no longer have, because of life circumstances, but I hold her in a great deal of high regard to this day. So I'm more than happy to sort of brag on her up until this point. So I do talk a lot about being mostly solitary, but I have in turn had that sort of, I very much did have a path. I did spend a short little stint. Again, this is at a distance because I was isolated in sort of rural Ozarks at this point. I did have another stint of instruction with a Wiccan high priest out of a coven out of Fresno, California. I was actually working on my second degree then. I got pretty far along. That man I am actually still in contact with, at least on social media. We haven't spoken in a good many years, but I have kept track of him. Probably ought to catch up with them, to be perfectly honest. And I do have a mentor now. It's one of those, this sort of thing is a constant learning experience, and not all of us go about things, especially those of the sort of folk witch or even shaman. I'm very hesitant to claim shaman because there's so many sort of indigenous connotations to it, but you know, those of that particular path, of that particular inclination, never seem to find teachers in the most conventional sense, or training in the most conventional sense of the word. So that gets a little tricky. Obviously, if someone listens to this and they're like, oh, you have a lot of experience and I think I'd like to actually learn under you, that's something that can be arranged. That's how I found my first teacher. It's something I'm willing to help people with here. That's one of the reasons I'm kind of throwing myself out there, not just for my business, but I'm getting a little too much more into sort of me again. But I do, even in the context of developed spiritual services, I've never actually sat there and outlined sort of who I am. So I'm taking this opportunity with the project to really do that. My next set of questions is actually related to what I do. I talk a lot about spirit working as being my primary specialty, and a lot of people who aren't familiar with metaphysics are going to be like, well, what is spirit working? The sort of meaning, the meaning is in the phrase spirit work. You're working with spirits. This can be related to sort of more 20th century spiritualism. There's certainly elements of that in there. I tend to take, again, I hate using the word because there's a lot of cultural baggage to it, but there's certainly shamanic elements there, even though I sort of hesitate to outright call myself a shaman. There's certainly elements of that there. There's sort of straight line spirit communication, mediumship, a lot of mediumship. That is a talent I have of mediumship. Spent a good deal of time, actually, a lot of the working that I am doing right now as far as sort of pushing myself forward is mediumship, because that's one of those things that's sort of been knocking at my door for a while, and it's something I can certainly do for people if the situation requires. It's not something I'm actively sort of promoting as a service, but that is part of what spirit work entails. And in turn, that goes into the more sort of I won't say simplistic, but the more physical aspects of what I offer as far as the service work. And that gets into sort of the spirit bottles and the spirit boxes. A lot of the core of spirit work, and to a certain degree, a lot of pagan traditions, especially of the polytheistic bent, which is something I work really strongly in, is ancestor work. And that goes into, why the spirit boxes are important. Why am I painting up these spirit boxes for people? So a spirit box is a spirit house. It is a spirit home. My first introduction forward into my actual practice was this wonderful article on ancestral and even sort of straight necromantic practice from a wonderful lady by the name of Sarah Ann Lawless, who has quite a bit of following in the sort of witchcraft, sort of pagan blogosphere, and she's actually one of my favorite writers, and I really became acquainted with that practice through her and sort of adopted it and took it on my own as far as sort of my personal ancestor work, and then eventually sort of adapting it into my own style and my own sort of way of doing things as a way of offering it to other people, because I found I had such a knack for it. And it was especially in the area I am, that's not something people were doing. That's not something people were even thinking about doing. So I was like, hey, and there's been a couple of times already where someone has been in need of it or been in need of something similar to it, and that's come up. That's part of the reason I feel like we have these callings, is because there's somebody out there who's going to need them. So that's what a spirit box is. Spirit bottles get a little trickier depending on what cultural context you're talking about them in. The way I use them is slightly modified from the traditional sort of European witchcraft way of doing them, and that is sort of more bringing in good energy, and that's actually more analogous to how sort of voodoo practitioners will use them, though they're usually sort of more used as offering foci, as I understand it. I definitely do take in elements of sort of that kind of practice, but again, because of cultural respect and that kind of thing, that's not something I outwardly claim to sort of work with those spirits. My spirit guides are distinctly my gods and my spirit guides are distinctly of a sort of North Celtic flavor, because I am primarily of Northern European heritage, and for one, those are therefore some of the most accessible gods. They're also ended up being pretty much some of the loudest, so for me. That's not true for everybody, and there's a certain nuance there, and I've certainly sort of tiptoed in sort of cultural spaces that I've had to be really careful about. But again, I really don't want to get into sociopolitics or culture, because that's a quick way to get burned. People have different opinions on that. For me, it's just definitely worked out both spiritually and sort of as far as my cultural respect, to just stick with who's talking and stick that's most relevant to my experience, and sort of going this sort of European Reconstructionist polytheism route, at least as far as my sort of religious approach. Not necessarily like my folk magic practice has been pretty effective, but that's I don't know, and that's a good segue into some of the other questions that I had written down, as far as, what is folk witchcraft? Folk witchcraft is definitely the sort of, when people think about normal magical distinctions, we think about high magic and low magic. High magic is that sort of Western ceremonial magic that I alluded to earlier, sort of the grimoire magic, Thelema, the Order of the Golden Dawn, things of that nature. That's sorely described as sort of in high magic terms. Low magic generally gets defined as sort of when you're casting for more mundane things, taking more mundane matters. Things that kitchen witchcraft definitely deals with a lot. Root working, a lot of sort of gree bags, and some of the sort of less sort of religious aspects of voodoo are very sort of low magic, or folk magic in a way. Folk magic does sort of segue into the religious, especially with like powwow and hoodoo, and depending on what certain elements, so reconstructive elements of heathenry definitely have a definite folk magic feel to them. Traditional witchcraft or sabbatic witchcraft has a folkish sort of feel to it. Folk magic has a very wide sort of berth there, and that's part of the reason why I claim it being so strongly eclectic, at least in what I'm willing to work with. I've started, as I sort of alluded earlier, I've gotten really a lot more defined as far as sort of who my core base of the spirits that I work with are, which didn't necessarily used to be the case before. But again, that's a sign of a more mature sort of experienced practitioner versus, me in my late teens just kind of bouncing around going, I'm going to talk to everyone I can because I can. That's the sign of an experience, but definitely still taking sort of the breadth of what I'm talking about. And I can definitely go in more detail as far as who those gods are, what those experiences are, and how that's really affected me. Why the dark? Why the dark? Why is the dark important? There's a lot of focus with psychic readers and psychic workers to focus on the light. This happens incessantly to the point where it can be a little annoying if you have any kind of initiatory experience where you're having to face that shadow. And in the short time that I've kind of been out there sort of practicing in the open a bit more than I used to, I even alluded in one of my Facebook videos about this, I'm used to very much practicing to myself and keeping it to myself and just only helping my friends and that kind of thing, not necessarily throwing myself out there as a way of keeping people or helping people, not keeping people. I do certainly collect people, I guess you could say, but a lot of it is, so much of this practice has been so personal and so much a part of myself that it's been hard to want to sort of offer myself out there, even though I know I've had a calling to do it. But and I think that's another reason sort of gravitating toward this dark sort of imagery, and essence is because so much of this is personal and introspective, and I don't work on a recipe. I don't work on there's no script here. I mean, here in this case, yes, I have a little bit of a script. I have some questions written out that I'm going on, so I'm not just sitting here rambling without much point or reason, even though I feel like I'm still doing that to a certain degree. But as far as like what I'm doing, this, you know, the pagan art that I do for the business, the spirit boxes, the bottles, all of which are hand painted, the herbal satchels, all of the things I do, right down to those, and then the card readings, the aura readings, the spirit work, that kind of thing. All of that is very personal to me. So when sort of people give me this indication that I just need to sit there and smile, or I'm going to just give you the good news, or, oh, there's some negativity in here and that's bad. No. So much of my journey here has been sort of crawling up mountains, getting my hands bloody, sort of getting myself to a position where I can actually sit here behind this mic and actually go, okay, this is who I am and this is why I want to be out here and actually sort of talking about these things. So that's part of the gravitation to the sort of darker imagery and sort of invoking the dark in the sort of tagline there for those seeking deeper meaning in the dark, because at the end of the day, so much of this is within ourselves. And if we're not willing to confront those shadows, then we're not really doing the work. Part of that philosophy, too, goes back to sort of me having a very much spiritualist and sort of animistic perspective on life. And that definitely kind of gives you a little more leeway on things aren't necessarily as gray. Things are a lot more gray than people tend to think they are. And that's probably reflected partly because of my sort of soft polytheistic bearings, I think, sort of speaking in theological terms. And also going back to the initiatory experience that I actually have referenced like 4 times now, but I have this written down in my notes, like devil figures and dark gods as forms of initiation. That's a very common theme, especially in medieval folk witchcraft. We have the sort of devil as initiator, and the sort of devil figure takes the form of many sort of dark pagan gods. You know, you have Odin, you have Hern, you have Kiernos, you have Hermes, you have all of these very sort of chthonic deities that are handing out these initiations, even in the modern pagan context. One of these gods I've worked with very closely. If you know me very well, you know who it is. So I'm a lot less afraid to deal with that. Now, obviously, my lesson moving forward is going to be how do I phrase that to you guys, to the rest of the world, that I'm not scaring somebody off or putting someone on the defensive, and that's something I'm very conscious of. But at the same time, especially going into this first episode, I really just want to emphasize that is who I am. This sort of dark introspectiveness is it's a part of my experience. It was a part of my initiation into the craft. It's a big part of what's keeping me sort of still going and whatnot. And to sort of end on a more light note, we do have the Beltane holiday coming up. And so a lot of people are talking about things like sex magic and maypoles and things like that. And that's something, it gets rehashed 100 times, but I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that and say, if you haven't already started thinking about that or reading or researching about that, that's something I highly recommend. Sex magic, even in normal sort of the pagan sphere, so to speak, is highly misunderstood. It's not something I work with closely a lot, but I know a lot of people that do. So it's something I would recommend looking into. So, obviously, I'm going to be doing these week by week, so this probably is not going to be the last time we talk about Beltane. And moving us back around, sort of towards the end here, about hitting the 25-minute mark here on this video. Just thanks for listening, and thanks for listening to me ramble about things and try and explain sort of who I am and what I'm doing. And hopefully this video has been somewhat educational to you. If it's been a little unclear, please tell me why. I'm definitely open to constructive criticism. Probably trying to be a little more exclusive on my topics lately, because I felt like I was bouncing a bit in this video, but we can sort of tweak as we go. So I will definitely keep my ears open for that kind of feedback, and hoping to hear from y'all soon. Nero de Valois out.